Imagine a river that appears to flow backward. Everyone who studies it assumes the current must have reversed at some point, some great flood, some catastrophic event. Then a hydrologist drops a dye marker into the water, and the dye reveals the river never changed direction at all. The current was always moving the same way. Every observer for 400 years had simply been standing on the wrong bank. That's what happened when geneticists finally got serious about Filipino DNA. The story most Filipinos grew up with has a particular shape. It goes something like this: brave indigenous people, then Spanish galleons, then 300 years of colonial rule, then American administration, then independence. A story of interruption, a narrative where the pre-colonial world is treated like a rough draft that history decided to edit heavily. And somewhere in that editing, the assumption crept in, quietly, almost politely, that the Filipino people themselves had been fundamentally reshaped. Replaced even at a genetic level, absorbed into something new. Geneticists did not set out to challenge that assumption. They set out to sequence genomes. There's a catch. The Philippine Genome Center, working alongside international research teams, began collecting and analyzing genetic data from communities across the archipelago, not just from major urban centers, but from highland groups, coastal communities, and indigenous populations across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. What they found did not match the colonial narrative. It didn't even come close. But to understand why that finding is so strange and so significant, you need to understand what the science expected to find. And that expectation has a history of its own. Colonial historiography, the version of Philippine history written largely by Spanish friars and administrators, painted the pre-colonial Filipino as a people without deep roots. Scattered barangays, loosely organized, waiting for civilization to arrive by ship. It was a convenient story. It justified the mission. And for centuries, it went largely unchallenged because the people with access to archives, printing presses, and universities were the same people who wrote it. Look, the genetic data didn't consult those archives. What researchers found instead was a population with extraordinarily deep continuous ancestry, genetic lineages that trace back not hundreds, but thousands of years on the same islands. The Austronesian expansion, which brought the ancestors of modern Filipinos into the archipelago beginning roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, left genetic signatures that remain strikingly dominant in modern Filipino populations today. Not diluted, not replaced. Dominant. Stop for a moment. Let that number breathe. 4,000 years. Think about it. The Spanish arrived in 1565. That's roughly 3,400 years after the genetic foundation of the Filipino people was already in place. You know, the colonial period, which many Filipinos have been taught to think of as a fundamental reshaping of who they are, accounts for a fraction of the genetic timeline so small it barely registers in population studies. Moving on. The Spanish did not genetically replace the Filipino people. The data is clear on this. Colonial-era admixture exists, yes. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, but it appears as a minor layer on top of a genetic architecture that remained fundamentally intact. The mountain communities of the Cordillera, the Mangyan of Mindoro, the Lumad peoples of Mindanao, they preserved something. Not by accident, by continuity. Now here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable for the standard textbook version of events. Because the genetic evidence doesn't only challenge the colonial narrative. It also challenges something that post-colonial nationalism sometimes assumed, the idea that the pre-colonial Filipinos were a relatively simple society that needed to develop. The DNA tells a different kind of story about what was actually here before 1565. Population genetics can track migration, trade, and contact through genetic markers. And the markers found in Filipino populations show evidence of extensive interaction, not passive absorption, but active movement, trade networks across Southeast Asia, contact with populations in Taiwan, Borneo, the Malay Peninsula, and the Pacific. The genetic diversity found within the Philippine archipelago is, by some measures, among the highest in all of Southeast Asia. More diversity, more history, more complexity than the standard narrative ever gave credit for. One specific detail that researchers keep returning to: the Negritos, the Aita, Agta, Ati, and related groups, collectively referred to in genetics literature as Philippine Negritos, carry genetic signatures that represent some of the oldest human lineages outside Africa. Their ancestors arrived in the Philippines potentially 50,000 years or more ago, before the Austronesian expansion, before agriculture, before written records of any kind. And those lineages didn't disappear. They exist today. Living people carry them. The oldest continuous human presence in the Philippines isn't a ruin or an artifact. It's a genome. But there's a detail. The implications of that fact have not fully landed in public consciousness yet. When researchers published findings comparing Negrito populations with other groups across Southeast Asia, they discovered something unexpected. Philippine Negritos are genetically distinct from Negrito populations in Malaysia and the Andaman Islands. Distinct enough that the similarities between these groups appear to be the result of convergent adaptation, similar environments producing similar physical traits, rather than shared recent ancestry. The Philippine Negritos did not recently migrate from elsewhere. They have been there, on those islands, for an incomprehensible stretch of time. Think about what that means for the concept of original Filipinos. Incidentally, the question of who counts as indigenous, who was there first, becomes almost philosophically dizzy when you're looking at 50,000 years of genetic presence. Every civilization that arrived afterward, every trade ship, every colonial fleet, every missionary and administrator showed up extremely late to islands that were already ancient with human life. But here is the detail that most people miss. And this is where the story shifts in a direction nobody expected. Important, the genetic continuity found in modern Filipino populations isn't evidence of isolation. The archipelago's geography, over 7,000 islands, didn't produce a fragmented, disconnected collection of unrelated peoples. It produced the opposite. Genetic studies show overlapping, interconnected populations that clearly traded with and moved among each other over millennia. The sea wasn't a barrier. It was a highway. Filipinos were maritime people long before anyone arrived to tell them how important maritime trade was. Pre-colonial Philippine societies had writing systems, Baybayin being the most documented, but linguists and historians have identified others. They had structured governance, trade relationships with China and the wider Malay world, and sophisticated agricultural and coastal economies. None of this is new information to scholars, but combined with the genetic picture, it forces a rethinking of the timeline. These weren't nascent societies on the edge of development. They were mature civilizations that had been running for thousands of years. And then came the cultural impact of what happened next. Because history isn't only genetics. When 300 years of colonial administration systematically suppressed indigenous writing, converted local religious practice, reorganized political structures, and installed Spanish as the language of power, something was interrupted. Not the people. The people remained. The genes confirmed that. But the transmission of self-knowledge, the chain of cultural memory that tells a civilization who it is, that chain took serious damage. The consequence is strange and painful. Millions of Filipinos today carry 4,000 to 50,000 years of genetic continuity in their cells, while simultaneously feeling uncertain about whether they have a real pre-colonial history worth claiming. The colonial project's most successful product was not economic extraction. It was self-doubt, which is why the genetic findings hit differently than a history book. You can argue with the document, you can question who wrote it, when, and why. But a genome is not an argument. It's a record, and the record says, these people were here, they were complex, they were connected, and they endured. Not because they were conquered and survived, but because conquest, in the biological sense, simply didn't happen. Fan communities and diaspora Filipinos online have already started running with this. Since population genetics studies on Southeast Asia began getting serious public attention, particularly after large-scale studies were published in journals like Science and Nature Genetics, something shifted in how younger Filipinos engage with their own history. The searches for pre-colonial Philippines and Baybayin spiked noticeably. Heritage language learning programs in the Philippines and among diaspora communities reported increased enrollment. People began digging. The cultural impact of a single scientific correction can be enormous, especially when the correction gives people something back. But there's a complication in this picture that most viral takes about Filipino genetics tend to skip over. And it matters. Stop. The genetic continuity story is real, but it's not uniform across every Filipino community. Some populations show higher levels of admixture from specific periods. Trade contact with China in certain coastal communities, for instance, left traceable genetic signatures that go back centuries before colonialism. The picture is layered. No single Filipino is a pure genetic representative of any one historical moment, because no human being ever is. What the genetics actually shows is not purity, precisely purity. It shows persistence, complicated, overlapping, regionally varied, but persistent. That distinction matters enormously, because the wrong lesson from this research would be to use it to argue for some kind of genetic nationalism. Geneticists themselves are careful about this. The data describes a population's history. It doesn't assign value. It doesn't rank cultures. What it does do, quietly, methodically, with the cold authority of base pair sequencing, is dismantle a narrative that was never built on evidence. You know, and here's where we leave this for now, because what comes next is genuinely strange. Researchers following up on the Philippine genome data began noticing something in the genetic record that points toward a pre-colonial history even more interconnected than the trade routes already documented. Genetic signatures that suggest contact, sustained contact, with populations that current historical records don't account for at all. Not colonial contact, not Austronesian migration. Something else. Something that predates the accepted timelines. The initial findings were flagged. More sampling was requested, and the researchers involved went quiet. Not because the data was hidden, because the data raised a question that nobody has answered yet. A question about who else was moving through the Philippine archipelago thousands of years ago, and why that movement left marks that the standard maps of ancient Southeast Asian migration simply don't show. That story is still being assembled. The evidence is real. And when the picture comes together, it may change not just how Filipinos understand themselves, but how the entire human migration story through island Southeast Asia gets rewritten. We'll follow it when it does.